aged well. This is a monthly live stream that we keep, and we had some technical issues on the last live stream, but we should be fine now. I don't know what happened in the last live stream. Our guest will be with us in just a minute. She's just getting her glass of water, but this week we're going to discuss the Tudor Dynasty, and keep in mind this is live. So, if you have any burning questions about the Tudor dynasty that you want to know about Henry VII, Elizabeth I, and or Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary, or Wars of the Roses, or even pre-Tudor history, now is a chance to ask them and get a direct answer from our expert historian on the Tudors. So, of course, written the book The Tudor Dynasty, and we discussed that book in previously on this podcast in episode 1 to 3. I think if you are on YouTube, it should be out there. Just it's a few, almost 1.5 years ago since we made it, and if you're find you can find it on Spotify on the Tudor Dynasty, of course. And like I said, our guest will be with us in a few minutes. You can also listen back to the podcast, this live stream, if you are listening on outside when it's not live, obviously. So now, right now, we're just running a little test. I am running a little test to see if the live stream is working as it should be. So she's back now, so we should be getting started. I just need to do the brief test. Just need to do a brief test here, so I'll be trying to entertain a non. Just 1 second, I need to check out how the live stream holds up. 1 second there, just. But yeah, while I do that, we are of course, like I said, live. So if there could be anyone asking questions, from the chat down below, if they have any questions regarding the Tudor dynasty, and that's kind of the purpose of the chat. This will be more like a normal podcast episode, so it's just live.
And what
So
time does it finish?
it's up to you. I think maybe 1 hour. 1 hour should be fine. So,
Okay,
but
great.
we do this more. The live streams I usually do more like a normal episode. So
Yeah.
so like treat it like it's a normal podcast episode. But if people have any questions, they can ask as well if they like in the chat. So I'm gonna share that we're live on Twitter and Blue Sky or Instagram. While I do that, why don't you tell us about your why you chose to study Tudor dynasty and this era? Of course, you don't just do the Tudors; you do the Stuart history as well. So, what was it about this era that you found so fascinating?
Um, well, it's a particular it's a seminal period of English history. There was a time of tremendous change, both with the Reformation during the Tudor period and the Civil War uh, during the Stuart period, that really shaped the uh, England we live in today. And it's full of great characters, great stories, irresistible drama, irresistible for any historian or indeed any writer. So that's why I enjoyed reading about it as a girl at school. I enjoyed a lot of films, Anne of a Thousand Days, about Anne Boleyn when I was a child, and then when I read history at Oxford. Tudors and Stuarts were obviously part of what I covered, and I very much enjoyed it there too. And I had some wonderful tutors.
Mm.
And in fact, I'm going down to, in fact, in March for a dinner where I'm the guest of a wonderful Tudor historian called Sue
Ooh.
Dora. So yes, so I look forward to that. I've got dogs. I hope that doesn't matter. I
That's
could be.
fine. Don't worry. That's fine. So let's
One of them is scratching on the sofa behind me.
Our cat do the same as well. So and she knows she can't do that, but she still does it for attention
Yes.
anyway. So let's begin with the early Tudor history. So that's are you able to talk a little bit about the Tudors in Wales before the time of Owen Tudor, who's relatively known as the first Tudor, but they did have some, as far as I understand from Nathan Amim's latest book on Henry Tudor. They had quite a maybe not prominence his but part, but they were part of the had some power in Wales before they became known as what we know as Tudors today.
Yes, they were important figures in Wales, but they weren't sort of high aristocrats, and there was no real connection to King Arthur, which is what Henry Tudor, Henry VII, would later claim, and indeed called his elder son Arthur. Owen Tudor was really quite an obscure figure who simply happened to possibly literally fall into a queen's lap at a party, having spun out of control while dancing wildly, and was by
No,
all
that would be
accounts.
every guy's dream, wouldn't it?
Sorry.
That would be every guy's dream, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes, exactly. And anyway, she fell in love with him and married him secretly, and produced, children by him. And her son, her royal son, Henry VI, by her first husband, Henry V, didn't know about these half siblings he had until he was a teenager. Had no idea that his mother had secretly married Owen Tudor. And when he found out, he actually put poor old Owen into prison, where he escaped. He actually sprung himself from jail. As far as I remember, it was Newdigate, which is was a very famous English prison, and had to be sort of captured and brought back again. But eventually he reconciled with his stepfather, who became a very loyal supporter of Henry VI, and indeed was executed after a battle in defense of Henry VI against his rival and cousin, Edward IV.
So let's talk a little bit about the Lancastrian line as well, and as the process of what will later be known as the Wars of the Roses, and why the Tudors I would say, half-baked claim for the throne. So let's talk a little bit about why they have the claim for the throne.
Well,
The Lancastrian state after, excuse me, after
Owen,
Henry V.
although Owen married a queen, she was French, and their children had no claim whatever to the English throne. But Henry VI married the elder son, his eldest of these half brothers, to a child, a 13-year-old child called Margaret Beaufort, who was of illegitimate English royal descent and a fellow Lancastrian from the Lancastrian family. And although she was only 13 years old, she became pregnant before her rather awful husband died, because, it wasn't considered good form to sleep with 13-year-old girls, even in the 15th century, even if you were married to them. He died, and when she was heavily pregnant, and she then gave birth to Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII. Henry VII. She was unable to have further children, and was probably rather lucky to survive childbirth, but she did, and protected her son as best she could in the years ahead.
So let's talk about the hereditary. Let's talk about Owen's to the son and how they would prompt, and again, to claim this here the Tudor side of things here. Again, this is incredible.
The Tudors had no claim to the throne. The
Yeah.
Tudors in the Tudor line had no claim whatever. There was a rather amusingly an illegitimate line. So Owen, after his wife died, after the Queen died, Henry V's widow died, he had a sort of girlfriend, possibly remarried even, but he certainly had a girlfriend. And she had a child. And one of the things I follow in my book, Tudor, the Family Story, is in fact the story of these illegitimate Tudors, these non-royal Tudors, who are related, of course, to the royal Tudors. And they pop up in every reign in quite important ways, which I find just particularly interesting. I wrote particularly about the family and the family connections. which is about power, because of course, when you're talking about a royal family, it's all about blood. Yes, I mean they pop up regularly at one point as the jailer to one of their royal cousins. Yeah, but the Tudors themselves in the male line had no royal blood, no English royal blood.
So let's briefly, and our main discussion will of course be the Tudors in power. So let's briefly talk about their rise to the throne and the Wars of the Roses as well.
Right. Right. Okay. So Henry VI, Henry V was one of England's greatest ever kings. You know, what won Agincourt, defeated France. He died when his son Henry VI was only a baby. Henry VI, unfortunately, was mentally ill, and he essentially lost France, everything apart from Calais. And this triggered a sort of crisis, and the rivalry of his cousins, the White Rose family, the Yorkists. So his main rival in the Wars of the Roses was Edward IV, the young Edward IV, Edward of York, who was known as the White Rose, and he defeated Henry VI, and indeed probably and had him in the Tower, where he probably murdered him. At this point, Henry Tudor was still a child, was still a boy. He fled England and Wales, through Wales, and went to Brittany to hide from Edward IV. And Edward IV continued to try and sort of get hold of him, really, wanted him dead, even though he didn't really pose much of a threat, but he didn't want any threat at all. But then Edward IV died, leaving two young sons as well as his daughter. And famously or infamously, these two boys were put in the Tower by his brother, by Edward IV's brother, Richard, who was proclaimed as Richard III, and these two boys then disappeared in the Tower.
Sorry for interrupting you there, but there's still to this day quite a debate as to what happened and there has been debates in the festivals on podcasts, of course, to this day. So what are your stance on the Princess of the Tower? I mean, there's been like 3 different books just the past 5 years regarding the Princess of the Tower. So what are your stance on them?
They were murdered in the summer of 1483 on the orders of Richard III.
So you believe they were murdered
with the help of the Duke of Buckingham? Yes, I do. I mean, and there are very good reasons why they were simply disappeared. Kings who were overthrown did not live long. You know, it wasn't possible to have 2 kings around. I mean, which is why Edward IV murdered Henry VI when he was in the Tower. He'd killed his son in battle, who was only 17 years old. So that was the end of that. He still had Henry VI, but since he got rid of the son, he was now worth getting rid of the father. So he did that. And that was the end of that. But what happened then was, so what they would do, and they would say, they wouldn't say, oh, I murdered Henry VI. They would say, oh, Henry VI, you know, died of natural causes. And indeed, they said that he had died of grief and rage. And they, you know, the body would be displayed and people would see he was dead. And then his supporters would see there's no point in continuing the fight and they would then support you. That was the idea. But then something unexpected happened after the murder of Henry VI. And that was the people of England decided that this poor man, this poor king, who had been mentally ill, was an innocent, like a child. And he's often depicted as a beardless boy, although he was, you know, very much a bearded man when he died. And that he was a saint. He was in heaven, he was a saint. And they prayed to him, and this huge, huge cult grew up. Now, these 2 little boys who disappeared in the Tower actually were children. They were also royal. They were also certainly innocent. And Richard did not want a cult growing up around the princes. So it was much more convenient to have them simply disappear. No relics, nothing was said apart from to the immediate family. So Elizabeth of, their mother was told. The Woodvilles were told. This triggered a revolt, which was, and the Yorkists who had been loyal to the princes in the Tower and to Edward IV turned to the only candidate available really to help get rid of Richard, who they perceived to be a murderer, and that was Henry Tudor. Henry eventually succeeded at the Battle of Bosworth in killing Richard III. He did not then, however, look for these bodies of these princes, because he didn't want a cult growing up around them either. After all, they were a rival dynasty. And so what he did instead, people say, oh, he got he owed his throne to marrying their sister Elizabeth of York, and certainly that helped him. But he did not claim the throne on the right of his marriage, which would have been very foolish of him if he had, because if she had died, that would have been obviously not very good. He claimed it by one right of battle, but also more, he said that essentially God willed it. It was God's choice. Not only had God helped him win the Battle of Bosworth, but his saintly uncle, Henry VI, had prophesied that he would be king. And Henry Tudor very much encouraged the cult of Henry VI, which became hugely, hugely important. And the only reason we don't know more about it and don't hear much about it is that, of course, all the monasteries and everything else associated with are all destroyed at the Reformation. So, and the whole cult of saints was destroyed and wiped out. So that all that sort of that very important part of English history was just sort of erased, like a sort of cultural revolution, you might say. So that's why we don't hear much about it. Anyway, so yes.
So what is some historians still believe that they weren't murdered, and that that the princes in the Tower actually just kind of disappeared. There seem to be some historians that think that they weren't murdered at all, that they just were not loose.
But of course, of course they were murdered. If one thinks about it, even for a moment, why would he have bothered to keep them alive? What happened was that, as I said, anyone who opposed Henry VII, as he now was, Henry Tudor, the Tudor king, they needed a candidate. They needed someone to rally round. Who was the great question? Now, I would say that, first of all, the obvious candidate was the first cousin, the royal first cousin to the princes in the Tower, the Earl of Warwick, who was a little boy. And what did Henry Tudor do? He put him in the Tower. So he had his own little prince in the Tower. And we'll come to the fate of this boy later. So he had his own little prince in the Tower. So they were first of all, they still tried, to use Warwick, and they got a little boy called Lambert Simnel and pretended he was Warwick, and, said, and sort of, led an uprising behind Lambert Simnel, who was defeated. And Henry VII then put him to work in the kitchens. And he actually lived a hale and long life, Lambert Simnel, and actually got quite a comfortable job in the end. But then the years passed, and Henry VII wasn't enormously popular. People still wanted a figure to rally around. Also, not just people in England, also people in Europe. Margaret of Burgundy, for example, who was Edward IV's and indeed Richard III's sister. So they found another sort of youth, and Perkin Warbeck, and they decided that the story was going to be that while the eldest son had been killed, the younger brother, had survived, because the murderer essentially felt sorry for him and thought, oh, no, I can kill, a 12-year-old, I can't kill a 9-year-old, or whatever it was. Which is just sort of, if you think about it, even for a second, fairly idiotic. But anyway, so Perkin Warbeck was sort of dressed up as the younger of the princes in the Tower, and was a massive thorn in Henry VII's side for some years. Eventually, he was captured and put in the Tower. And again, a bit like with Lambert Simnel, he'd occasionally be brought out and sort of, to have sort of fun picked at him, to show everyone how ridiculous it was that anyone had ever thought that he was a royal prince. But then, come the late 1590s, 1597, 98 from memory, I can't remember exactly, off the top of my head, Henry VII is trying to arrange a marriage for his son Arthur with Catherine of Aragon. And her parents are not that keen. They say, well, you've had all these problems with Perkin Warbeck, and you still have the Earl of Warwick, who, FYI, has much greater claim to the throne than you do, in the Tower, and we just don't feel it's safe. We don't feel your dynasty is secure. And so what Henry VII does, which is very shameful and which I think was on his conscience for the rest of his days, what he did is that he then pretended, arranged a kind of sting where it was essentially, a plot was invented where Warwick was going to escape from the Tower with Perkin Warbeck and sort of kill him. And so they were tried for treason and executed. And people were appalled. Even Polydore Virgil, the contemporary writer who was a supporter of the Tudors and wrote, obviously, during the Tudor period, said that people were shocked and horrified by the judicial murder of the Earl of Warwick, the last Plantagenet in the male line, son, or anyway, it's the nephew of Edward IV and Richard III. And indeed, Catherine of Aragon is supposed to have said that her marriage began in blood. And later, during the reign of Henry VIII, one of his heirs, the Duke of Buckingham, believed that there was a prophecy dating back to this judicial murder, that as a punishment, the Tudors, that no male heir born to the Tudors after that execution, after Warwick's execution, would live to adulthood, which of course they never did.
So let's talk about Henry VII as a ruler, because they seem to be doing rather well at first, but when his wife died, who seemed to absolutely be in love with, that kind of changed everything. So let's talk about him in this, what I would call the first part of his reign, and then what I would call the second part of his reign, to split it in two parts, more or less.
Well, I suppose the first half of his reign, he spent quite a lot of time having to sort of secure it from pretenders, as I said, numerous uprisings. And he was understandably neurotic about the greatness of the House of York. And so, for example, his mother-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, was obliged to live very quietly. And when she died, she was buried very quietly. I think one of the things which was very telling, as I said, not only did he not look for the bodies of the princes in the Tower, but there were no sort of public masses said for their soul, which is quite shocking. No chantries set up where you would chant prayers for the dead, which is all sort of indicative of his paranoia and his feeling that he didn't really have a very strong grasp on the throne. What helped is that, of course, he did have several children by his wife, Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York. Arthur, who died, and when that happened, the elder son died. When that happened, that brought about a sort of terrible burst of paranoia, and you suddenly have this figure, Tyrrell, who suddenly sort of just gives details of the murder of the princes in the Tower. And I think it's because Henry wants distraction from the fact that his son has died, the very fresh memories of him killing Warwick. But he still has young Henry, of course, the future Henry VIII. And so you have these last years. His wife Elizabeth dies, trying to give him another child. after the death of Arthur. And I think, as far as I remember, she gives birth to a daughter shortly before she dies, and he's sort of devastated by that. And he is an extremely sort of ruthless king. He raises a lot of money and is quite sort of tight-fisted. And the advantage of this, although he's not massively popular, far from it, is that Henry VIII, when he does inherit the throne, is a rich and secure king. And one of the first things he does is he has two of Henry VII's most unpopular henchmen executed, which is sort of indicates as well just how ruthless Henry VIII was. Henry VIII was already popular when he was 18, when he inherited. And one of the reasons for this is that he didn't look at all like his father. He was a spitting image of his maternal grandfather, Edward IV, who people remembered as a sort of glorious warrior king.
Sorry for interrupting you for 1 second, but I want to ask, because what the picture that most people imagine Henry VIII is, of course, the obese guy at the end of his reign. But what did it look like? You said he was a spitting image of his grandfather, but
he was well, as a young man.
Was he a handsome young man?
He was exceptionally handsome young man. He was described as the best looking sovereign in Europe years later, let alone then. Even when so this was 1509. So even 10 years later, 15 years later, when he was his fellow sovereigns were Charles V, who was sort of 18, and who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and Francis I, who was also a young man. Henry was far better looking, described as far better looking than either of them, with beautiful skin, a wonderful figure. He was very tall, extremely athletic, very musical, very successful at jousting. He was everything a king was supposed to be. He was pious. He was glamorous. Everything anyone wanted. And as I said, Edward IV had also been like that as a young man who had become king when he was 18 as well. But at the end of his life, Edward IV had died quite young because he had become seriously decadent and was extremely fat. And in his case, unlike Henry, to be fair, also was notorious for sleeping with every woman within a sort of 50-mile radius, and was quite vicious as well. And of course, it's interesting that the young Henry VIII very much resembled the young Edward IV, and people didn't really consider that he might also come to resemble the older Edward IV, as he indeed did. But anyway, so he looked like the young Edward IV, and so people were sort of very struck by his glamour. His glamour, as I said, he had everything. He was intelligent, handsome, everything a king should be.
Was he as notorious as we know him to be later? I think most people have the image of Henry VIII as a notorious ruler who just killed off his wife left and right. And I'm exaggerating, of course, but was he notorious as young as well, or would that come with the age?
No, he wasn't notorious at all when he was young. I mean, as I said, he could act ruthlessly, as he did when he got rid of these two henchmen. But no, he was very pious. He seemed to be quite sort of devoted to Catherine of Aragon. If he had any mistresses during those first few years, he was extremely discreet about them. He would have been aware. So Henry VII brought him up to be well behaved when it came to women. And one of the reasons for that, there was actually political reasons for that. One of the reasons for that was that Edward IV had been notorious, as I said, a notorious womanizer. And when he died, this had been used against him and used against his sons. And it had been claimed that his sons were illegitimate and that he had a sort of fraudulent marriage with another woman, and that so he wasn't properly married to Elizabeth Woodville, and that so his sons were illegitimate and had no right to the throne. And it was very much used against him. And so Henry VII had brought Henry VIII up, not to be a womanizer. And Henry VIII, to be fair, for a king, was not actually a womanizer. He did have a mistress. The most serious one was someone called Elizabeth Blunt, by whom he had a son, the future Duke of Richmond. And from memory again, the boy was born in 1519, so 10 years after Henry came to the throne. So Henry would have been about 28. And by then, his wife, Catherine of Aragon, was several years older than he was. And although she apparently had a beautiful complexion, she was not considered good looking, not considered handsome. She had lost several children and was aging badly.
Were Catherine of Aragon related to Charles V as well? I don't remember if they were cousins or if they were.
Yeah,
What side?
she was Charles V's aunt. So Charles V's mother was her sister Joanna, and it was through Catherine of Aragon's sister that Charles V inherited the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, which had belonged to his maternal grandparents. His maternal grandmother being, and her grandmother being, her mother, being Isabel of Castile, who was one of the greatest ruling queens Europe has ever had, a seriously tough woman, worth bearing in mind when one thinks about Catherine of Aragon's character and the character of her daughter, Mary Tudor, that, this is the stock they came from, Isabel of Castile, who threw the Muslims out of Spain.
No, of course we don't have too much time. I could spend an entire live stream just discussing the 6 wives of Henry VIII. But let's go through the wives of Henry VIII because I think that's but actually before that,
Yes, sure.
before we go to the wife, I want to talk about another guy that comes in the picture. We're going to get to the wives in a minute, and I'm sorry for derailing here, but there's someone I want to discuss, and I think you know who I'm referring to here. It's of course Thomas Cromwell. So let's talk about how Thomas Cromwell, and has been a BBC series on him recently, and I want to see it, but I live outside of the UK, so I haven't found any streaming sites to actually watch it yet. But when it become available, I'm certainly interested in watching it. And of course, what is your thoughts on the Cromwell series? And let's discuss a little bit about Thomas Cromwell's rise to power.
Well, it'd be better to do that with the wives, really. So,
sure.
While Catherine of Aragon was around, he largely he was a servant of Henry VIII's chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who was the most powerful man beneath a king that England had ever known and indeed would ever know. And he was so powerful because he was not only a cardinal, he was a papal legate, he was Chancellor of England. So he held both secular and church power. But he had a problem, or he discovered he had a problem, because when Henry VIII decided that he needed to divorce Catherine of Aragon, or needed to dissolve the marriage, more accurately.
And we should be clear as well, sorry for interrupting you again, but we should be clear that divorce, as we think of in modern terms, wasn't really a thing in the 16th century. So when you talk about divorce, it's more like an annulment of a marriage.
Well, there was divorce, which had just been, so there was divorce because Martin Luther, the sort of founder of the Reformation, had declared in 1520, I think, that marriage was not a sacrament, and therefore, as it wasn't a sacrament, you could divorce. Henry VIII, however, had written a response in defense of the sacraments, including the sacrament of marriage, which he would always hold. Sorry?
That would backfire a bit, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So he wasn't given to changing his mind, Henry. So Henry absolutely hated Luther, opposed Luther all his life, and opposed divorce. So yes, Henry was certainly seeking an annulment rather than technically a divorce. An annulment, i.e., he was saying that his marriage had never been valid. And he said it had never been valid because Catherine of Aragon had, as I described earlier, been married briefly to his elder brother, Arthur, who had died. And he said there were biblical references that said that you couldn't legitimately marry your brother's widow. Now, unfortunately for Henry, there were other bits of the Bible that said you should marry your brother's widow. So I mean, anyway, he said the Pope didn't have the right to say it was okay for that marriage to go ahead, and therefore it wasn't a legitimate marriage. Now, this posed a great problem for Wolsey, who had to try and persuade the Pope to do what Henry wanted, and he wasn't able to do that. And the result was that he fell from power, and he might have been executed, but he died before that could happen. Now, Thomas Cromwell at the time was his servant and was one of his best servants, and he essentially took over Wolsey's shoes and became, although he wasn't a churchman, he became a sort of new Wolsey, except that he was very pro-reform in the church. Now, this was very convenient for Henry, because Henry, who had been very loyal to the papacy, hence writing this book against Luther, now needed to have an argument that meant that he didn't have to do what the Pope says. So you had this strange sort of conjunction of sort of reform, of reformists, people who wanted reform in the church, some of whom were proto-Protestants, not all, and Henry's desire to be free from, being free of the Pope, basically. Now, Thomas Cromwell actually really believed in religious reform, and was probably, if not a Lutheran, was probably a sort of proto-Protestant, which would be part of his undoing. But anyway, for the time being, he managed to help engineer parliamentary support for Henry to break with the papacy and proclaim himself emperor in England. So he was essentially Pope in England. And this was also backed by his Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, who was a friend of Anne Boleyn's. Now, he's in love with Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn also believed in church reform. She probably wasn't a proto-Protestant, but she didn't really have time to sort of think much about it, because she was going to die so young. But she certainly believed in reform, and she certainly, encouraged Henry to break with the Pope.
I want to ask about that, because how much is it thanks to Anne Boleyn that Henry actually, how much can she be credited for the divorce to the Pope?
Oh, I think she played a very important role. She'd had a long interest in religious reform that predated her relationship with Henry, and she was an extremely intelligent woman, and she managed to show him things, books and things that helped him formulate in his own mind, before it was made public, why he was justified in breaking with the papacy, breaking with Rome. So she was very important in that. And so the marriage to Catherine was annulled, and he married Anne Boleyn. They then produced a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. This was obviously a disaster for Anne, but because she was supposed to produce a son.
Forgive me if you mentioned this before, but wasn't there another curse on Tudor that it wouldn't, that you said, they wouldn't get a male heir to the throne?
Exactly. But obviously Henry believed that there was only a curse on his first marriage. He believed there was a curse on his first marriage because of marrying his brother's widow. He did not believe in the curse which was put on after the judicial murder of the Earl of Warwick. He chose to ignore that one. Anyway, so
Conveniently.
conveniently, yes. Well, people believe what is most convenient for them to believe generally.
Mm.
But anyway, so gosh, I'm sorry. I've just seen this deer running past my window. Sorry,
That's fine.
distraction. Wow, look at that. It's a
Mhm.
muntjac, rather ugly kind
Just
of
turn the
deer.
camera around and we want to see as well.
I don't know where it's gone. No, because I was
Just find the gun and you have dinner for the night.
Yes, no, exactly. Get a rifle. No, poor thing. Wow. I was wondering what it was. There's such weird looking deer. Anyway, so we're going through into the divorce. Catherine of Aragon. Anyway, so yes, so the annulment happened. The marriage was annulled. He'd married and had this child, Elizabeth. Bit of a disaster, but it was still possible that she would have a son later. Catherine of Aragon then died. So if he did have a son, it would be much easier because lots of people in Europe still regarded his first marriage as valid. But now that Catherine of Aragon was dead, if he had a son by Anne, that would be very good news. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell was working for Henry, doing lots of great stuff for Henry, dissolving monasteries and giving Henry the money, and which he'd actually started under Wolsey. It wasn't that uncommon, dissolving small monasteries.
No, again, I'm sorry for interrupting you again so many times, but I want to go a little bit more into the dissolvement of the monasteries, because of course we made an episode about this a while ago with James Clark, and we talked about this in a more recent history of the monastic world. But what are your thoughts on how the credit that Henry VIII gets for dissolving the monasteries, and how much involved was he regarding the dissolvement of the monasteries? Because I believe that at least James Clark and Andrew Yotishki, sorry if I say his name wrong, they will both believe that Henry VIII kind of and wasn't that involved in the disillusionment of the monasteries, and that they kind of had run their natural course, so to speak. So what do you think there?
I think that's nonsense. To be honest, I think that's rubbish. What's true is that small monasteries. It was not uncommon for monasteries to be dissolved and the money to be shifted elsewhere. Wolsey who was a cardinal, don't forget, had been dissolving monasteries and putting the money into building a foundation, for example, at Oxford. He was going to build a new college, Cardinal College, which subsequently became King's College, Christchurch, and also a school which was going to be a feeder to Cardinal College, which was going to be his version of Eton, the famous public school, which had been founded by Henry VI. But what Thomas Cromwell had said to Henry VIII was, look, rather than putting the money into educational foundations, you can have it in your pocket and you can use it to fight the French or do whatever you want. And so that was great. Henry was very happy to have this money. Now, unfortunately, Anne Boleyn hadn't really clocked this. She hated Thomas Cromwell. She didn't trust him because he had been a close ally of Wolsey, who had been, in her mind, her great enemy and had failed to get the annulment of the marriage. So she was keen to get rid of Thomas Cromwell. And she had one of her priests give a sermon in which Thomas Cromwell was compared to Hanan, a sort of biblical figure who had been giving bad advice to the king and who was ended up executed. It was really quite a threat to Thomas Cromwell. Now, Anne made this threat shortly after she had miscarried a son. Not great timing. So she was in a very weak position with Henry, who already had a new mistress in the form of Jane Seymour. And Thomas Cromwell was now determined to help get rid of her, which he did by essentially framing her for adultery and treason. And so her head was chopped off. And within a few days, as far as I remember, it was literally days, and it wasn't very long, Henry had married Jane Seymour and had both his daughters, Mary Tudor by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth Tudor by his second wife, Anne Boleyn. He had them both declared illegitimate on the grounds that neither marriage had been valid. So he also claimed that his second marriage to Anne had never been valid. And why was it not valid? Because he had had an affair with her sister, Mary. And so it was an incestuous union, just as his first marriage had been an incestuous union. Anyway, so he married Jane Seymour, and she produced a son, Edward, the future Edward VI. Unfortunately for her, she died a few days later. He was, of course, Henry was, of course, delighted. But at the same time, there was people would get lots of people across England were getting very, very angry about the dissolution of many local monasteries and religious change. England had been, before the Reformation, had been one of the most content parts of the Catholic Church in Europe. And so there was this massive rebellion that became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was the greatest rebellion England had seen since the Peasants' Revolt in the 14th century. And Henry was really quite traumatized by this, because, you know, one of the main things a king had to do was maintain peace, and to have a rebellion on this scale really shook him. And after it was suppressed, that is when the really big program of dissolutions began against the big monasteries, the really great monasteries, until every monastery in England was eventually suppressed and destroyed. And to say that, you know, the greatest monasteries were sort of in their death throes is sort of, I don't know why anyone would suggest that. Yes, and they were mourned, you know, generations later.
But we discussed
So, I'm sorry?
in our episode on the disillusionment that monasteries play an active role in the local society. They serve as hospitals, and they serve as, you know,
Yes.
kind of all this social welfare that we would later get in the modern era. But they kind of had a role.
They were also centers of education.
Yeah.
You know, local people had invested in these wonderful churches and so forth. You know, they had given things to the churches. You know, they had their relations buried there. You know, they had children who were there as monks or nuns. Yes, they were places you stopped, like, you know, like inns to, you know, to stay. They served all sorts of purposes.
So imagine losing this when Henry VIII actually disillusioned it, and the consequences that it must have had to lose all this, to call it for, to use a modern term, lose the social welfare that you had with the monasteries.
Yes, indeed. You had to have these new laws put in, poor laws, but I mean, yes, no, absolutely. There were some very cruel things that went on. These, you know, they even introduced slavery in England at one point under Edward VI, I think. Anyway, very unpleasant. So Jane Seymour was dead. A new wife, because, you know, Henry had a son, but that son could die. More children, the better, frankly. So Thomas Cromwell suggested that he make a foreign marriage to a Protestant princess. Well, not a Protestant, because the word Protestant wasn't really used yet, but princess from a sort of Lutheran country, you know, from a sort of reformist country, Germany, Anne of Cleves. And Henry admired a picture of her, and they were sort of married, and then she appeared in England, and Henry took one look at her and was appalled, found her very unattractive.
So he was the kind of catfish, to use the modern phrase.
He wasn't. She what? Now the truth is that she wasn't physically unattractive, but she just didn't. She just, I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and there were other beholders who said that that Anne of Cleves was a very attractive woman, but she was dressed in German fashion, which to English eyes looked completely hideous. And actually, indeed, if you look at pictures of the kind of fashions that Anne of Cleves would have worn, it really is quite frighteningly ugly. Whereas,
to be fair, you are British as well, so
yeah. Well, no, but the British admired French fashion. You see, Anne wore French fashion. And so that's what the English liked. They admired French fashion and they were horrified by German fashion. So anyway, Henry claimed, she made him impotent, and he claimed she wasn't a virgin because her bosoms were all floppy, which obviously was completely untrue. Anyway, so they were divorced or annulled. The marriage was annulled on the grounds that Henry, hadn't consummated it.
I think that Turn from Earth, she has a really Philomena Turn has a brilliant bit about. I don't think she's from Turn from Earth, but it's somewhere where she says like Henry VIII had so many wives named Catherine that you can say he was a Catholic.
Yes.
So the joke goes.
Well, Anne of Cleves, anyway, was going to survive a long time. She was rather amazing, Anne of Cleves. She lived well into the reign of Mary Tudor, interestingly. So she outlived all the others. She outlived all the others by some margin. But anyway, so where did this leave Thomas Cromwell, who had suggested the marriage? Not in a good place. He had married Henry off to Anne of Cleves, and Henry was none too pleased about that. Secondly, he was pursuing reform too aggressively. Henry was a natural conservative. He was naturally, it was very convenient for him to break with the Pope, but actually he was a religious conservative. And he felt very much that, as I said, he was Pope in England, not Thomas Cromwell. And he was fed up with that. And Thomas Cromwell had, of course, made many, many enemies who were looking forward to bring him down. And so poor old Thomas was accused of treason and had his head chopped off. By which time,
I'm sorry for the modern analogy, but it kind of occurred to me, and I don't know if you agree, but I feel like Elon Musk is a bit of a Thomas Cromwell type. That maybe he will suffer the same fate. I feel like he's kind of a bit Thomas Cromwell-y in a way.
That's an interesting comparison. It's an interesting comparison. Well, I tell you, I think Thomas Cromwell is a lot. I suppose. What's that actor called who plays him in Wolf Hall? Suddenly, the real Thomas Cromwell was nothing like that. Sort of rather sort of fey actor. Well, he's certainly very, yes. I mean, I can see where you're coming from. What with Trump as Henry VIII. Trump has been compared to Henry VIII, actually.
Yeah.
So maybe,
maybe more Ivan the Terrible than Henry VIII, I would say.
I didn't hear that. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
I would say Trump is more Ivan the Terrible than Henry VIII, perhaps. To be fair.
No, I don't think so. No, I really don't think so. I can't see Trump going around sort of, murdering people and using them as a footstool, to be fair. But anyway, so
sorry, I just had to. I couldn't help myself to that.
Anyway, so but Thomas Cromwell dead, and by which time Henry VIII was already poised to marry Catherine Howard, niece of the Duke of Norfolk, pretty young girl, also was to end in disaster. Because unlike Anne Boleyn, this young girl really did have an affair and was caught at it and was sold out by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, which I have to say, Cranmer has his admirers, but really, can you imagine? He must have known this girl he was sending this girl to her death. Not a nice thing to do. for anyone to do, let alone a cleric. But anyway, so poor old Catherine Howard also went to the block very, very bravely. There's a nice book written about her by a man called Gareth Russell, which I would recommend. It's a good read. So we then have wife number 6.
Conveniently, this Christmas I actually wrote a 6 wives of Henry VIII just based on the 12 days of Christmas. I sent it to you a while ago.
Yes.
I just felt that it was so fitting, the melody, just to do the 6th wife of Henry VIII to the 12 days of Christmas.
Yes, quite. Anyway, so Catherine Parr, who, of course, there's been a film made about her recently. It's called Firebrand, written by the novelist Elizabeth Fremantle, who also wrote a book called Sisters of Treason, which was inspired by my book on Lady Jane Grey and her sisters. So I know Elizabeth Fremantle well. Anyway, and there's this film now called Firebrand, which is about Catherine Parr. So Catherine Parr marries Henry VIII, and by now he is fat, old, hideous, and extremely bad-tempered. But he predeceases her and dies in 1547, having bequeathed his throne to his son, Edward VI, who is 9 years old. Now Henry VIII is paranoid that what happened to his uncles, the princes in the Tower, could happen to Edward VI. And so he has set things up in a way to prevent that from happening. So what he's really frightened of, Henry, is any adult male relatives who are heirs to the throne. He doesn't want a Richard III figure, basically. So his daughters have no right to the throne because they are illegitimate. So he has an act of parliament passed that declares them his Edward's heirs. So Edward is to be followed in line of succession by Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and when Mary dies, to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. Neither are married. Mary is certainly very much a marriageable age. Henry does not have her married because he does not want an adult royal male threatening his son's claim. And he could have had his daughters legitimized by act of parliament, since he had an act of parliament make them illegitimate, but he doesn't. He keeps them illegitimate, so they're quite weak as heirs. He then looks at the long stop heirs. If Elizabeth dies, who's next? In blood, it should be the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, the granddaughter of his eldest sister, Margaret of Scots, the Stuart claimant. Now, because he has no control over Mary, Queen of Scots, even if she is just a sort of child, she could be married to the King of France, as she eventually is. So he demotes Mary, Queen of Scots in line of succession. And in her place, he puts the heirs of his younger sister, who was Mary, Duchess of Suffolk. And he doesn't even leave it to, so his sister, Mary, Duchess of Suffolk, has a daughter, 2 daughters, in fact, the eldest one called Frances Brandon, and Grey, Frances Grey, actually is her surname rather than her title, Frances Grey. He doesn't even leave it to her, because, of course, she's married to an adult man. No, he says the long stop heirs are her daughters, who are children, unmarried, with a very distant claim in common law. And they are called Lady Jane Grey, Lady Catherine Grey, and Lady Mary Grey. And this will have important consequences later. Anyway, for all sorts of reasons. It's very important. Anyway, so Edward VI is now king. He's only 9 years old. Henry wanted a council of equals to rule England until his son is of age. And he wants this again because he doesn't want anyone too powerful. But that changes, of course, the minute he's dead. Henry has no power, he's dead. A life lesson: you can't control things that happen after you're dead, however powerful you are when you're alive. People write wills and all the rest of it, don't they? But they can only do a certain amount. They can make life difficult for next generations. They can't control it.
Now we don't pass 1 hour with it. I said we do 1 hour, but you want to go on, or do you want to end it right now? How do you feel if you want to go on?
Well, I'm happy to go and have my bath. Shall I say? Yeah, because I mean, exactly. Yeah. So, how do you want to tie it up?
It's up to you, really. How you feel you want to do just a brief history of from Mary, because we mostly focus on Henry VIII and Henry VII in this live stream.
Okay.
I'll give a quick roundup.
Yeah. Okay, so to give a quick roundup, what happens is that Edward's non-royal uncle, his Seymour uncle, Edward Seymour, becomes Duke of Somerset and rules as protector of England. And he is the one who introduces Protestantism into England and makes England a Protestant country. Unfortunately for him and for Protestantism, Edward VI dies when he's only 15. And Mary Tudor becomes queen. She is, of course, a Roman Catholic, so you have a reversal. But then she dies without children, and you get Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and so Protestantism is reintroduced. And Elizabeth, of course, lives for over another 40 years.
Sorry for interrupting you so many times, but I want to ask, because how you maybe taught it earlier, how the Mary and Elizabeth were delegitimized. So how did they justify the claim that both Mary and Elizabeth would become Queen of England?
Well, the key thing, what is a key thing, which the Stuarts will never really understand, is the importance of Parliament. They were queens by act of Parliament. Now, when Mary came to the throne, she had the act of Parliament that had declared her illegitimate withdrawn. She was generally viewed as, because she was legitimate in canon law, even if her parents' marriage was invalid, because they had believed it to be valid at the time. Elizabeth, by contrast, never did that because she was illegitimate in church law. So she actually remained illegitimate all her life, but it made no difference because they were queens by act of Parliament. Now, when Edward VI died, he had tried to make his cousin Lady Jane Grey queen. And the reason this failed is that although it was in his will, Parliament, he called Parliament, but Parliament did not have time to assemble before he died. So when he died, Mary Tudor was the heir by act of Parliament, and that's what mattered. Elizabeth was queen by act of Parliament. What was difficult for her was that Lady Jane Grey, who was by then dead, had two younger sisters who were her heirs, and she was actually extremely concerned about them and destroyed them long before she destroyed Mary, Queen of Scots, as she famously did. Mary, Queen of Scots was, of course, executed. Most people don't know the story of the younger Grey sisters because it doesn't fit in with national myths. National myths is all about the Protestant Elizabeth against the Catholic Mary Tudor, Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, sorry. And the fact that she destroyed Protestant heirs is very counter English national myth, so we don't hear much about them. But if anyone wants to read my book, The Sisters Who Would Be Queen, then it tells that story.
And I always joke that the hardest thing to believe in the Mary Queen of Scots movie is the fact that Margot Robbie play a virgin queen. That's the most unrealistic thing I believe in the movie.
Well, I don't think Elizabeth would have been a virgin if she was possibly able not to be, but she was in a difficult position, poor woman.
But let's round it up there. Of course, we made an episode about the Tudors over, I think it's almost 2 years ago now. It's crazy how time flies. And of course, you can always watch this live stream from the beginning once we end this live stream, or you can watch it from the beginning right now, and you really should, because it's such a fascinating. Tudors are such a fascinating topic. You can read her book as well. I would highly recommend reading her book. So, but of course, for those watching this later and those who are online now, where can people find your work? Where can people find you on social media, or anything else you want to promote for the live
Um,
stream?
well, I'm quite lazy with social media. I am on Twitter. I think I'm at Leanda Delisle. And I do have a website, which probably needs updating, leanderdelisle.com. You should be able to get my books in any bookstore. If they're not in stock, they can order them. And also available on Amazon and all the usual places. And I've written, I said, 2 books on the Tudors, or have I written more? No, and 3 on the Stuarts. So yeah, Leanda Delisle. There you go.
Thank you
And
so much for coming on doing this live stream on the Tudors. They're such fascinating. I always love doing Tudor history. Yeah, thank you, and thank you again. We are available. This has been Well That Aged Well. We are available on social media on Twitter. Well That Aged Well, Blue Sky. Well That Aged Well, Instagram. Well That Aged Well. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. We are trying to do a monthly live stream once a month. I'm not sure what the next live stream will be, when or where, but just look for it on Twitter or in the YouTube post, and I will keep you updated. Always check out our other podcasts, and of course our episode on the Tudor Dynasty. If you look up on Spotify, it should be episode 1 to 3, and just scroll down on YouTube to find the episode as well. It's called the Tudor Dynasty with Leanda Delisle. You should absolutely check it out. It's a brilliant episode, and of course read her books as well. Enjoy your bath. This has been my name is Alan. This has been With That Aged Well. Take care and a good weekend.
thank you. Bye.
There you go. What do you think? Are you
Yeah,
happy with the
good.
results?
Good. Phew.